On April 18, 2011, Jessica Bullock couldn't sit still all day. It had been a whole day since she had been able to reach her mother, 46-year-old Rebecca or Becky Porter, whereas they usually talked every day. Jessica was particularly concerned because her mother had been complaining of feeling unwell, possibly food poisoning or something similar. Jessica urged her mother to go to the hospital, but Becky, who disliked missing work, kept putting it off. On April 17th, the last time they spoke, Becky promised her daughter she would check on herself in the morning. Yet, evening had come the next day, and there was still no word from her mother. Jessica checked with other family members, but they couldn't reach Becky either. Jessica deserves credit. She could have assumed that with Becky's husband, Russell, or Rusty, as his relatives lived nearby, there was no cause for concern. But no, she decided to check in person. Jessica got into her car and drove 45 minutes to her mother's house. She hadn't been there many times, but she immediately sensed that something was wrong. One of the doors was wide open, lights were on inside the house, and her mother's car was parked in the driveway. Jessica approached the door and called out for her mother, but all she got in response was chilling silence. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. The only illuminated house in the middle of a large plot of land, seemingly occupied but unresponsive to calls. Fearing what she might find inside, around midnight, Jessica contacted the Greene County, Missouri Rescue Service. The responding police officers thoroughly searched all the rooms and informed Jessica that there were no intruders inside. However, they couldn't calm her down because there was nobody in the house at all. Instead, they encountered a plethora of details that alarmed even the experienced officers. Disorder reigned in the bedroom. Items were strewn across the floor, including bedding, and the mattress was askew, as if someone had abruptly jumped out of bed. Becky's phone and purse containing credit cards, cash, and documents were left behind. Rusty's medications lay on the bedside table. He took them daily after his cancerous tumor removal, and he would have taken them with him if they had left. However, how could the couple have left the house if their only car, which they shared, was parked at home with the keys in the ignition? In another room, likely a home office, a tangle of cables lay on the floor. But the most alarming discoveries awaited the officers in the kitchen. First and foremost, they were almost overwhelmed by the strong smell of bleach. Puddles of bleach were gleaming on the floor, yet the only bleach bottle under the sink was completely full. The kitchen window was open, and the protective screen on it was torn. Finally, after circling around the house, the officers discovered scattered broken surveillance cameras. It seemed like initially they were positioned to cover maximum area around the house, but someone had walked around the house and destroyed them all. Some cables connected to these cameras ran through the walls of the house, leading to the same home office where the tangle of wires lay. When the officers returned to the room, they realized that the cameras and monitor on the floor were connected to a computer, which was conspicuously absent. This was one of the most telling pieces of evidence, especially considering that Rusty had installed the cameras quite recently. Moreover, it's not common for people to install so many cameras in the middle of a farm. Was Rusty afraid of something? All the findings suggested that the spouses weren't together at the time of their sudden disappearance. The first theory of the detectives was that perhaps Becky and Rusty became victims of a botched nighttime robbery. However, the evidence didn't support this theory. Besides the car and cash, other valuable items like the television remained untouched. Maybe Rusty got into trouble, owed money to someone, and the couple decided to disappear this way. Did one spouse do something to the other, get scared of the crime committed, and flee? Or did someone attack them in the middle of the night? At that moment, investigators were considering numerous scenarios, each worse than the other, and doubted a favorable outcome. The police began questioning friends and relatives of the couple, starting with Rusty's mother, Kay Simmons, who lived in a small house directly behind the family home. She recounted that Rusty and Becky had only been married for about a year. The newlyweds moved into the house on the 49-acre property owned by Kay's parents. Also, less than a kilometer away from the young couple, Kay's brother and Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, lived with his wife Carolyn. Rusty and Becky seemed like a very happy couple, but their relationship raised doubts among their close circle. Some were uneasy about the 12-year age gap between the spouses, and Jessica and her brother even skipped their mother's wedding. On the evening of the previous day, the 17th, Rusty's son dropped by to ask his mother for painkillers because Becky wasn't feeling well. According to Kay, Rusty behaved as usual and didn't tell his mother anything that would worry her. She also didn't hear any strange sounds later that night. But when she stepped onto the porch the next morning, she saw Becky's car. Kay was surprised because Becky was a very responsible, hard-working woman who never left for work later than 7:30. Despite her son and daughter-in-law living just a few steps away from her house, she tried not to intrude and didn't go to them, simply assuming that Becky stayed home because she was unwell. but now she was certain that something had happened to her son and daughter-in-law before the morning of the 18th. Meanwhile, detectives questioned her about Rusty and Becky's relationship. Did they have any problems? Could anyone have harbored a grudge against them? And Kay immediately thought of one person. Before marrying Rusty, Becky spent 26 years in a marriage with a church pastor. However, they decided to divorce, and according to their friends, they couldn't part amicably. The former spouses fought for a long time over ownership rights of the restaurant they had previously managed together. They had been divorced for only 4 months when Becky met her future husband online. Naturally, this piqued the interest of investigators, and on the 4th day of the investigation, they questioned the ex-husband. However, it quickly became apparent that he had no connection to Becky and Rusty's disappearance. Although their divorce was accompanied by scandals, the man continued to live his life, and he had a solid alibi for the time of the couple's disappearance. Moreover, he seemed genuinely upset about what could have happened to them. After ruling out Becky's ex-husband, the police continued to delve into the personal lives of the newlyweds. Once again, the investigators quickly uncovered something interesting. Becky had complained that she couldn't stand it anymore and things couldn't continue like this. When the police questioned her daughter Jessica about this, she said that her mother had confided in her that she and her husband had been arguing frequently lately. Of course, various negative scenarios immediately sprang to the detectives' minds, suggesting that Rusty might have done something to Becky and then fled. However, unlike Becky's family, all of Rusty's relatives and friends unanimously insisted that he sincerely loved his wife, and they had never seen him happier. He truly loved her and had changed for the better because of her. So why did the woman complain to her daughter about problems? It turned out that Becky had grievances, not against her husband, but against his family, specifically against one person. Becky's grievances were directed towards Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell. Robert lived nearby Rusty and Becky on the same 49-acre property. Kay and her brother Robert had always been very close, but he didn't like the fact that his nephew had settled on the property, which he likely considered entirely his own. He was very possessive about anything that belonged to his parents, down to the smallest details. The rift between uncle and nephew had escalated to the point where both had tried to obtain restraining orders against each other multiple times. The last time Rusty filed a complaint against his uncle was 1 or 2 weeks before the disappearance. In his statement, Rusty described how Robert, passing by the couple's house, shouted that Rusty should be careful because he wouldn't stay there for long. When investigators spoke to Robert, he didn't deny the obvious and admitted that his relationship with his nephew was strained, but he claimed that the threats were just words without meaning. Moreover, he had more reason to fear Rusty, as he was just an old man with health problems. And of course, he would never harm his nephew or his wife. Additionally, Robert had a very solid alibi. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, and during the couple's disappearance, he was headed to Texas with his wife. This was confirmed by phone records for both Robert and his wife, Carolyn. With Becky's ex-husband and Rusty's uncle ruled out as suspects, investigators hit a dead end. However, another crime shook them out of it. On April 25th, a week after the couple's disappearance, police were called to the scene of a double homicide of another married couple. The second crime eerily resembled the disappearance of the Porter couple, and it also began with a call to 911. Early in the morning around 5 o'clock, a neighbor of the couple called emergency services and said he had scared off a stranger wearing a black hoodie. The person ran away down the road. When officers arrived, they found Donald and Helen Willingham murdered. They had been attacked with a knife. The similarities were striking. An unknown assailant had broken into both couples' homes. Almost nothing was stolen, and there were no obvious suspects. Furthermore, Donald was a pastor, and Becky had been married to a pastor for over 20 years. Investigators pondered whether the cases were connected or if it was just an astonishing coincidence. Was there a serial killer roaming the county, targeting married couples? However, a breakthrough occurred in the Donald and Helen Willingham case 3 months later. A young man named Jose Huckleberry was arrested on charges of robbery. After 7 hours of interrogation, he confessed to the murders. When detectives learned his motive and the details of the attacks, they had to admit that these two cases were not linked. The situation for the investigation was not improving. All the evidence collected up to that point suggested that Rusty and Becky's disappearance was linked to some crime. But what? Now the investigators had neither a motive nor any suspects. The couple's relatives and friends did everything possible to keep the public aware of the case. They printed a huge number of flyers and posted them in all frequented places, gave interviews to local media, and, of course, continued to cling to the only glimmer of hope in the realm of dark thoughts and forebodings: hope. Despite the grim circumstances, the community remained supportive, rallying around the missing couple's loved ones and assisting in any way they could. The search for Rusty and Becky continued, fueled by determination and the unwavering belief that answers would eventually surface. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, a new lead emerged. A prisoner serving time in the local jail came forward with information that would interest investigators. Shortly before his arrest, he was relaxing in a bar where he met a man named Tony Friend. They struck up a conversation during which Tony boasted about several crimes he had committed. Among them was the murder of Rusty and Becky Porter. Detectives were skeptical of the informant, who naturally came forward only in hopes of striking a deal with the prosecutor. However, they were obligated to investigate. At the very least, they needed to find out who this Tony Friend was. The more they delved into the man's past, the fewer doubts remained about the informant's words. Tony Friend, 43, had a history of repeated involvement in violent attacks and armed robberies, rather than minor offenses, indicating a propensity for cruelty. However, it was only after examining his phone data that detectives believed they had a solid lead. On the night of April 17th, he was in close proximity to Rusty and Becky Porter's home, and then he headed towards the Cedar Creek area, known for its vast expanse of dense forest. Although investigators didn't know exactly where, they invited him in for questioning, but it proved to be a futile exercise. Tony denied any connection to the couple, claiming he hadn't committed any crimes and had no knowledge of the matter. He didn't answer most of the questions, and those he did answer were so evasive that essentially the only thing he confirmed was his name and age. Detectives had hoped for a more fruitful outcome, but they were now convinced that they needed to dig deeper in this direction. Knowing that Tony had been near the missing couple's home before heading towards Cedar Creek, investigators decided to speak with his relatives and friends. Since Tony grew up in the area, he likely knew it well, and there could have been a secluded spot known only to his close acquaintances. They were right. Tony's cousin immediately recalled a place where they used to play as children. It was an area with dense vegetation near Cedar Creek, inaccessible by car. The kids called it the bulldozer spot, because that's where old, non-functional cars were dumped. There were also dilapidated and abandoned cabins, which had been falling apart since they were children. The woman led the police to this location, and it turned out to be the piece of information they had been missing. On July 21st, the police headed to the specified location in Cedar Creek, specifically to the old cabin where Tony used to play with his friends in his childhood. Immediately, they detected a distinct smell, the unmistakable odor of decomposition. In the center of the dilapidated cabin, amidst piles of debris, they found a hole in the wooden floor. Inside, they discovered the bodies of two individuals, still dressed in their pajamas. Blood at the scene indicated that they were killed right there. The bodies had significantly decomposed, and investigators relied on dental records and DNA to confirm their identities. It was Rusty and Becky. Autopsies revealed that each of them had died from a single gunshot wound to the right temple, fired at close range. The discovery of the bodies dashed the last hopes of Becky and Russell's family to see them alive. It was even more difficult for them because they couldn't comprehend why someone would do such a thing. It was an execution-style murder. However, the investigators' task shifted from searching for bodies to finding the killer, and all circumstantial evidence pointed to one suspect. The police had another ace up their sleeve. Despite Tony's hardened criminal background, modern technology played a crucial role in the investigation. Officers revisited Tony's phone data and discovered that 3 of his close associates, his wife, Wendy Friend, his son, Philip Friend, and his nephew, Dusty Hicks, had followed a similar path to Tony on the night of April 17th, the day the couple went missing. If Tony remained tight-lipped, perhaps they could pressure one of them. Investigators identified 26-year-old Philip, Tony's son, as the weakest link among the accomplices. During the period between the couple's disappearance and the discovery of the bodies, Philip had been implicated in a theft and was serving time in prison. He had already experienced incarceration, so when detectives threatened him with charges of double homicide, he agreed to talk. On December 17th, the young man revealed that his father had offered him a job to ensure that 2 individuals would never celebrate another birthday. It was criminal slang for murder, and Philip understood the gravity of the task and agreed to it. So, on April 17th, according to the boy's account, his father, Wendy, Dusty, and he got into the car and headed to Rusty and Becky's house. Wendy stayed in the car while the others put on gloves, balaclavas, taped the cuffs of their sleeves and pants with tape to not leave a single hair at the crime scene, grabbed a bottle of cleaning solution with bleach, and headed towards the family's home. They destroyed the cameras and searched the entire house for a way inside, but they were unsuccessful. They were about to leave when Dusty noticed a partially open kitchen window. They cut through the protective screen, pushed the window open, and Tony helped Dusty crawl inside. Dusty then opened the back door. The accomplices then entered the couple's bedroom. They startled Rusty and Becky awake, and Dusty and Tony pointed their weapons at them. Naturally, they were terrified, begged for mercy, and didn't understand who had burst into their home and what they wanted. But the criminals had more important matters to attend to than explaining anything to their victims. They generously poured bleach all over the kitchen floor, took the computer where the surveillance camera footage was stored, and, after tying the victims' hands with zip ties, led them to the car. It's remarkable how much effort the accomplices put in to avoid getting caught. In light of this, it's simply astonishing that Tony himself confessed his involvement in this to a stranger in a bar. Be that as it may, they dropped off Wendy at home and went to the location chosen by Tony, now known to the police. The accomplices parked the car in a field right in front of the dense forest, so vast that no one would hear a gunshot or screams. Tony instructed Dusty and Philip to wait while he led the spouses away. In their pajamas, barefoot, at gunpoint, they obediently walked into the woods. It's hard to imagine what they were feeling at that moment. Surely they understood they wouldn't be coming back, but they obediently pressed forward. According to Philip, he and Dusty sat for 10 minutes when they heard a gunshot, and it was only another 10 minutes later that the second shot rang out. The horror those 10 minutes must have been for the second victim. Tony never revealed what happened in that abandoned shack in the middle of the dense forest. There are many self-evident assumptions about this, but due to lack of evidence, they remain just that. And Philip could only talk about what he knew for sure. And according to his admission, it was only when his father emerged from the darkness of the forest alone that he began to understand what they had just done. After Philip's confession, investigators had only one question left that demanded an answer, although they already suspected the answer. Why did his father decide to kill two people he had never even met before? For this job, he was promised $100,000. And for Philip, this was no secret. It was Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, and his wife, Carolyn, Tony's sister. It was Robert who was the mastermind behind the murder, planning the attack for a time when he himself was supposed to be away in Texas. In fact, aside from disputes over the 49-hectare plot of land they lived on, he had a second motive. Robert was selling stolen equipment and using his property for these purposes. Rusty and Becky didn't like this, and they weren't going to stay silent about it. They raised a fuss that annoyed Robert. Becky was very afraid that unknown individuals were lurking around their home, so her husband installed cameras facing different directions from the house. Irritated by their behavior, Robert decided to get rid of them, to silence them forever. Naturally, he turned to Tony, a hardened criminal, and conveniently enough, his wife's brother. As the police learned, he approached Tony with a request to kill his nephew. Tony inquired about Becky, to which Robert coldly replied, "If she's there too, then kill her too." Tony agreed. Robert was arrested, but he stubbornly denied everything. He constantly reminded the investigators that he had an alibi. When the charges were brought against him, Tony and Dusty pleaded guilty. Tony and Dusty were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. Wendy decided to try her luck in court, was found guilty, and received a similar punishment. Robert also opted for trial, which made prosecutors nervous. Except for Philip's testimony, they had nothing solid against him. However, Philip agreed to testify against him and performed well in court. It was thanks to him that Robert was convicted. He was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. He will never see the light of day again. For his cooperation and willingness to plead guilty, Philip was sentenced to 13 years. Robert's wife, Carolyn, took her own life, unable to bear it all. She faced charges only for perjury. Arguments in people's lives are common and inevitable, and nobody really expects that a dispute will result in such consequences as murder. Becky and Rusty didn't like Robert's illegal side job, and they didn't hesitate to speak out about it directly. They knew it was dangerous. Becky openly feared the suspicious individuals who appeared near their home, and Rusty even installed a series of cameras to protect his wife. Unfortunately, it didn't save them. On that fateful night, when the couple walked into the woods in their pajamas and barefoot, did they suspect that Uncle Robert was to blame, wishing to get rid of the troublesome nephew and free up the house? Did the killer say anything to them before pulling the trigger? Or did the spouses believe to the last that it was some random attack, and the quarrels with Uncle Robert were just silly arguments, and he would never harm his nephew and his wife?